Welcome back to the Pure Perspective Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Van Blaircom. We have an incredible episode for you today, but before we get started, if you haven't already, make sure to check out our new website. We have tons of information about our new housing initiative and ways that you can support us. So if you haven't already, subscribe, share, help us to get the word out. My next guest, Connie Bush, is a retired Minnesota Department of Corrections. She held a variety of positions during her tenure of over 30 years with the department. Connie talks about her own traumas that she experienced throughout her life. She opens up about some of the experiences that she had on the job, as well as unique perspective working in a pretty high pressure job like the Minnesota prison system. Connie was a member of a team who provided peer support to other employees after traumatic events. Connie just has a wealth of knowledge, and I was so excited to sit down and learn from her. I know that you guys are going to appreciate her story as well. So, without further ado, enjoy the episode.
Well, I appreciate you meeting with me
Yeah.
today, and just kind of the little bits that you've shared with me. I'm kind of, I'm really interested just to learn more about kind of peer support, and then, whatever you're comfortable with sharing, with your own journey.
Sure.
Kind of into recovery. Obviously, we met in certain rooms, and so,
Right.
so I guess if you kind of want to go back and maybe start at childhood or...
Yeah. So for what happened with me, or this is my third, I celebrated 5 years of sobriety in February, thank God. And
It's amazing.
but I tried it in 91 and I tried it in 2001.
Okay.
And so just a little background, I grew up in a southern Minnesota, small town in southern Minnesota. 7 siblings, not all of us lived in the house at the same time, but huge history of chemical dependency in our family and some mental health stuff. And my father grew up in the deep south of Georgia.
Okay.
He was a Marine.
Cool.
And I'm going to throw in a Southern Baptist. So I don't know if you're familiar with the South, but when you're at a young age, you learn to respect your elders,
Yes,
whether
ma'am.
they deserve
No,
it or
ma'am.
yes.
Yes,
and
sir.
so
No. Yeah.
up here, I had to say yes, dad, and no, dad, and yes, mom, and no, dad, mom, and things like that. But wonderful parents, however, they came from, families that were a little bit broken, and so they brought their baggage to our lives. And I've always said, I don't think my parents woke up and said, you know what, I'm totally going to make sure that my kids go to therapy when they're older.
Right.
But the things that they experienced, they pass on to us. And so at a really young age, I was afraid of my dad. There was no physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, but there was always that, because he was so demanding of respect, that I grew up with anxiety from him, and so attached to my mom. And my mother was a wonderful, sweet person. She did not struggle with any chemical dependency. But like I said, 6 of us, 7 siblings, at one point or another, either were actively drinking in some form of recovery. So, and then my father was in recovery too.
Sure.
And so I learned at a young age that I was responsible for how other people felt. My behavior was responsible for their feelings, which is really confusing for a small child. And so...
Huge job for a small child, too.
Huge job for a small child. And also, I should say, I love all of the religions. I would never trash any of them, but my mother was Catholic. And so I went to Catholic grade school and Catholic high school. And you learn a lot of shame and guilt.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's necessarily the way that they're teaching their religious beliefs now, but back then you did, and so I felt responsible for so much that I had no business being responsible for. And so I also grew up with June and Ward Cleaver, Father Knows Best, and Leave It to Beaver, and the Brady Bunch. And in the course of a half an hour, the patriarch solved all the family's problems in 30 minutes, including commercials, every single time. And I'm like, why is our family not like that? So a lot of confusion, and I kind of felt like I had this hole in my heart, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And so I tried to fill it. and I didn't know what to fill it with, so I filled it with people or food or alcohol. And so I always had this thought that there was a person that was going to solve all my problems for me in my life, a
Yeah.
boy. So that's kind of the background of that. So anyhow, I started a career in corrections in 1986. And I wanted to save people. And I learned very quickly that I couldn't, but that I could bring information to people and they could decide, what would help them and what wouldn't. But it was a, 34-year career of working with very, very dangerous people.
Yeah.
And in 1991, I got to a point where I had panic and anxiety and couldn't figure out where it was coming from. And I called my sister, and I actually had a gun. I didn't want to kill myself. I just needed some attention. I needed to get someplace where I could just sit. And so I ended up going to a 72-hour hold. It's the only one I've ever had to do at St. Joe's Hospital, and then eventually transferred to Fairview Riverside. And what I ended up doing was an outpatient treatment program,
Sure.
half-heartedly. I never embraced any of the steps. I went through step 4 in the program. I did a 5th step to a priest, and this was 91. And then the one sibling that doesn't drink, I made amends with her. She grew up in a sick household too, and so she just didn't drink. She just had some other stuff. Sure. And I proceeded in my 9th step to tell her what those other things were, which is a horrible thing to do. And then I met a boy and I got married very, very quickly and pregnant very quickly. But I wasn't honest with him about how serious this disease is. And to be fair, I didn't really understand it. So I had zero insight back then as to what my role was in any of my recovery.
Yeah.
And so needless to say, after about 6 years, I relapsed. And it was very secretly, closet drinker, literally. I would do anything I could to be quiet about it, but it progressed and I had another child. And in 2001, so I relapsed for about 4 years, and in 2001, my marriage came to an end, and it was a good thing. And I stopped drinking again. This time I started going to the club here in River Falls.
Okay.
One day a week. Had a sponsor who was a boy. Poor decision, very poor decision. I had a crush on him, but I never cracked the big book. I went to meetings for a while, and then I had a partner who was also sober, so I figured him and I could do this together. And by this time, I'm raising my 2 young boys, and I'm looking back at my father's recovery at this point, thinking he was just a dry drunk. He didn't really embrace any of these steps. He was still scary, and in the meantime, we developed this great relationship, give and take, where I wasn't afraid of him. My sisters were still afraid of his presence well into their adulthood years, where I wasn't. But I wanted to blame him. I wanted to blame everybody. And so I was with a partner who got cancer. And so I spent 7 years helping take care of him. Well, he wasn't there for me, and alcohol was. And I relapsed. And that started a 12-year relapse. I did not have the courage to come back into the rooms of AA. There was no way I was coming back in. And I've always had God in my life, but it was like, just not yet. And it got progressively worse. And during this course, I was working for corrections and saw a lot of trauma. And one of my responsibilities was I was a peer support specialist for critical incident stress management. So it was a great part of my job, and I helped other people through their traumas. But what I did was go home and drink, because I was helping them but not myself, and not paying attention to any of the red flags or any of the triggers or any of the traumas that I experienced. It was just easier to help you than to help myself.
So first of all, I didn't even know that there was such a thing. And I think that's incredible that they offer that support in those settings, because I couldn't imagine. I mean, I've been to prison on the other side of things myself, and I couldn't imagine having to deal with hundreds of me. But I mean, it's a stressful job, law enforcement, and so I think that's awesome that they have that. I think,
Yeah, it is, and it's pretty amazing, but we're kind of taught to just be tough, and nothing gets to you. And so And in almost my entire life, I've worked specifically with men, both in the field and in the people that I supervised. And I am, a lot of the men, they don't want to talk about
Right.
it. But
Right.
what this opportunity provided them was a chance to just talk about something that they experienced. And most of the time, when I would reach out to them after a significant assault or whatever it was that happened in the correction setting, they didn't want to talk about it. But the more we got into this debriefing, which is a very trained 7-step process, they would start opening up. And that was really encouraging, because the work that we do is dangerous work,
Yeah.
day in and day out. And so I'm really grateful. That was one of the most, it was 28 years of my career. That was one of the most satisfying pieces of my career, was
So,
being able to help staff.
How did you end up in that role? Like, was that something, like an opportunity just presented itself, or was it like a training that you just?
Well, most of the people that are on the team, and the Department of Corrections in Minnesota, this was the first correction-specific CISM team, Critical Incident Stress Management, because typically it's firefighters, ER nurses and doctors, EMTs, police officers. But we had an HR person that was walking around reading incident reports and seeing all these traumatic things that were happening, and asked what was there for staff. And in my situation, I had been significantly threatened by an inmate,
Okay.
where we ended up having to take him to court in Washington County. Significant threats to my life. And so I know what it feels like to feel that trauma and that fear. And so that's kind of how I got on the team.
Okay.
And, I feel like, I've always been an empath. And, one of the things my father, bless his heart, told me when I started in corrections, he said, "You're never going to make it because you're way too nice." I'm like, okay, so I guess I'm not going to be nice. So unfortunately, I went to the other end of the spectrum, and I wasn't very kind, and through my sobriety now, I'm looking more at the people that were under my care and realizing they all have stories. It doesn't give them a pass for horrific crimes that they've committed, but if we can get to the root of the whys, then let's see how we can not do any more harm moving forward.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, it wasn't always the offenders, the people that I supervised. Sometimes it was the toxicity of the staff, and that was unfortunate. But I have met some great offenders in the facilities that have done some wonderful things with their lives. And have really, truly, committed horrific crimes, but have, found their higher power, mine is God, and have been able to make some huge changes and affect change in other offenders in the prison. So that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So, but for me, in 2018 was a significant year in corrections. There was a lot of staff assaults. It was pretty horrific. And by this time, my drinking had just really picked up. The interesting part about when I would relapse is I would go back to peers and colleagues that knew that I had stopped drinking, and I would say, I started drinking again. And they would say, "Oh, Connie, it was just situational. You were just going through some tough times." And I'm like, yes, they just allowed me to give myself permission to drink.
Thank you.
Yes. Oh, I feel so much better. And there was still all that shame and guilt, but, and my children didn't, I have 2 children, 31 and 26. They didn't grow up with me drinking. But when I look back at how I've embraced my sobriety this time and how I was thinking my dad was a dry drunk, so was I. I never addressed any of those things. I never took any accountability for my role in any situations. And I'm just really grateful that now I'm able to have some of that insight. But kind of what got me to, so I never had any consequences with law enforcement because of my use. Thank God. But it got to a point in 2018, my oldest child, who was not in a relationship, came to me and said, "Mom, we're really worried about you. And I'm scared for you, I'm scared for us." And he said, "I need you to know, if I ever start a family, when I start a family and I have children, if you're drinking, you don't get to be part of their life." And I thought, sure, I'm gonna quit, I'm gonna promise, I promise, knowing full well I wasn't ready. And I thought, in hindsight, what a really brave boundary a child should have to set for his parent, but also what a really sad.
How old was he at this point?
26,
Okay,
25
sure,
years
sure.
old.
Yeah, that's
but such a sad boundary.
of
And
course.
so, but
Yeah.
that wasn't enough to get me to stop, which is really shows you how powerful this disease is, you know,
Yeah,
how
yeah.
incredible hold it can take on you.
Yeah.
And it took another year and a few months. But for him to be able to say that to me and how worried they were, I don't live with regrets anymore about that because I've made amends and I try to make a living amends while I'm living my life. But in February of 2020, right before COVID took hold of our nation, our world, I just got to a point, such a low point. I was living with panic every day.
Yeah.
I would have to drink maybe a half a beer before I could even get to work, which is really sad and dangerous. And, we talked a little bit about this before. I didn't wake up every day and say, I'm going to fuck up my life today.
Yeah.
Today I'm going to fuck it up. I would wake up and think, I'm going to do it today. Today is going to be the day that I don't drink. And by noon, I would get to, okay, I could probably drink again. And where can I go? Which liquor store didn't I go to yesterday? How fast can I drink so I can just go to sleep at night? And it just kept cycling over and over and over. And this particular day, I was like practically an entire month, I was just calling in sick for work. And my boss finally said, my supervisor, this is something more, right? And I called him and I started to say, I'm having some anxiety. And he said, don't say anything else. We'll start FMLA for you. Do what you need to do. So much support there. And my son took me to an emergency room. And I just wanted him to admit me so that I could calm down. Because this anxiety and fear was just so insurmountable. And this elderly social worker showed up and she said, we're not going to admit you. Like, dang it. And she said, you really just need to get outside, get back to nature. And I'm like, really? That's the answer to my issues with drinking? And she said, and we should also address your alcohol use. And so I, that night, went back to my son's house and something spiritual happened. And I just surrendered. And I was like, I told my son, I can't live like this anymore. So I ended up going into an inpatient treatment program at Berkwood in Burkhart. And I think I overcommitted to the level of services that I needed, but I needed to find a place to sit. And I remember being in there terrified that people were going to find out about my career. Because needless to say, there's a lot of people that don't like people that have the authority to lock you up or take you out of prison. And so that was a huge fear and huge shame for me. But I remember sitting in this room after dinner with all these people one night, and I was like, my God, who are all these people? This is the biggest bunch of misfits I've ever seen in my life. And all of a sudden, I'm like, they're mine. These are my misfits. I'm one of you. And we all have this disease, and we share this common thread. Our stories look different, but they're the same. And I just truly embraced it. And this time, I decided to do a deep dive into my childhood, into those relationships, not just necessarily with my parents, but school and friends and boys, and really try to understand what makes me tick. And I always wanted to blame my father, because he was emotionally distant. And what I found out a couple years ago from one of my siblings was that he was in World War II. And then when the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he re-enlisted for another, 8 years or so. And he was a gunny sergeant, and he ordered a kid to go get some water to cool off a machine gun or something, and the kid was too afraid to do that. So my dad went. And when he came back, his entire unit was wiped out by a mortar. And that was the moment I was like, he gets a pass. Now I understand the post-traumatic stress that he was experiencing, his lack of ability to be emotionally present all the time. Like, okay, that's okay. And that helped me in my healing. And I don't mean to get teary, but it was such a turning point for me. Like, oh my gosh, okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. Had I known that, back in 91, maybe that would have made a difference. But you know what? All of it happened the way it was supposed to and got me to where I'm at here. So, now I have a very sweet friend who just celebrated 50 years of sobriety.
Wow.
And he had sponsored me for a while, and I used to listen to him in meetings, and he would say, my life's the best it's ever been. And I would be so freaking mad, and I'd be like, oh, fuck off. Like, when is my life going to get better?
Right.
Because for a long time, I just held this just tight grip between my head and my heart and my higher power. And it finally occurred to me maybe several months ago that he worked really hard to get where he is today. And what I've listened to, and I'm so grateful for, is that a lot of these men, I haven't heard a lot of women talk about it, but a lot of these men will say, I was in meetings for 20 years before the tools of this program really took a stronghold, and I learned from them. And I'm so grateful for their experiences of not taking this program serious and then finally
Right.
getting it, because it helped me listen and pay attention and want to get it sooner. And, there's something in the 12 and 12 book that says the term of your sobriety has nothing to do with the quality of it. So you can have 50 years and be miserable, or you can have 6 months and really be embracing the program. And so I'm grateful that I listened to that, and so, I have made amends with people in my life. The father of my children, didn't really like him when we were divorced and I was raising the boys. But now I tell him all the time, I'm so grateful you gave me we created these two beautiful humans, and we get to be part of their lives together. We're spending times together and stuff like that. So that's kind of where I got to here.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
It is. Yeah, it's a lot.
I know, sorry.
No, this is great. I'm just, I'm kind of reflecting, like, what you shared about, first of all, working in corrections, and maybe we'll go back to that for a minute. So I've heard stories, and maybe you can expand on this a little bit, but is it a higher rate of alcoholism in those settings? I mean, I would imagine.
I talked to a fella, I was working with him briefly, and he wasn't in corrections, but he had started at one of the facilities and was talking to the security squad, and this was like 8 years before, and he said they told him, if you're not divorced, you probably will be. If you're not a drug addict or an alcoholic, you probably will be. The likelihood of committing suicide is very high. I mean, it's a high stress situation every single day. Not in every facility, but the ones that I worked in, it is.
Yeah.
And I mean, you talk about, I had a law enforcement officer say to me when I told him that I was retired Department of Corrections, he said, you guys had it way worse than we do. And I was like, wow, thank you for identifying that, because every single day you're wrestling with the most dangerous offenders that our state or nation have to offer. And you don't even let the other shoe drop before you jump to the next one and the next one and the next one situation. And whether it's putting somebody in custody or putting somebody in segregation or whatever it is, you just don't even have the chance to breathe. So by the end of the day, you're driving home and you're like, wow. And then you get back up and put your uniform on and go back to work the next day. And I wasn't uniform, but and it's just cyclical. And, it can be very, very depressing and very toxic, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And and so I've had the opportunity, we've talked about this, to help with peer support still with the Department of Corrections. And, I retired September of 20. And I just recently had an opportunity to meet with a lot of corrections people and let them share stories. And it's sad to me that 5 years have passed, but the stories are the same.
Yeah.
So for them, being there and supporting each other is really important. And to have peer support in the facilities so that staff know that they're not alone is really, I think, really critical.
Absolutely, yeah. I think I'm still amazed that they offer that. I had no idea that was even a thing. So I think that's super valuable, and also, like,
I mean, and it is, you have staff paying attention to incidents that happen. And like I said, that's why that human resources woman, Julie, was like, wait a minute, all this stuff is happening. What are we doing? Our staff need this support so that they can come to work every day and start all over again and be recharged. And I don't know if you heard me talking about the brain stain.
Mm-mm.
So whenever a critical incident or an incident happens to a person, regardless of whether it's in a job setting or in the community or in your home life, there was a Dr. Gordon Blush that talked about this in training once. And he said you get a stain on your brain, just like a ketchup stain on a white t-shirt. It's there. It's always going to be there. And our tendency is to not talk about it.
Yeah.
It's to stuff, for me to numb, to drink, whatever. But the more you talk about that situation, the less and less that impact has on you. It never goes away, but it helps you navigate how you deal with those triggers or those red flags when they come up.
Yeah.
So, I think it's really important in my sobriety to pay attention to my triggers.
Yeah.
If something's happening with me, I might need a meeting, I need to talk to my sponsor, whatever's going on, it's really important for me to honor those and respect those, because not doing so could lead to me relapsing. And I've told people I can't afford another relapse.
Yeah,
I don't, I did it in 91 and 2001, and it's such a progression, for this disease. So, and I try, so I'm grateful that I'm able to help still with corrections and provide peer support and, my perspective from things.
Yeah.
But I also sponsor people in the community,
Yep.
women in the community, and, this afternoon I'm taking an older fella from a club to a movie just because he's, just needs something to do. And so just being able to be there. And I think also to allow people to talk and to normalize, I was terrified when I first got sober.
Yeah.
I have a future daughter-in-law that met me when I was 5 months sober, met my son. And I was like a stage 5 clinger. I didn't know how to navigate feelings because I hadn't had them for decades. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, my nose is, runny. I call my kids, my poor children were like, Mom, you're supposed to be the supportive person. And I was just a hot mess. And somewhere along the line, I stuck around to see the miracles happen. And so did she. Thank God. And now she's the mother of my 3 grandbabies, and I'm so grateful she's in my life. But it's crazy what happens. With our emotions and
it's amazing to have the insight to be able to look back at those moments and see those like turning points in our lives. It's what would you say to someone who might be going through it right now and doesn't quite know where, I mean, I can relate to what you kind of shared about not wanting to go back to those rooms, right? Because it's like we convince ourselves that like they're not going to understand or whatever it is, that prevents us from going back. Like, what would you say to someone who might be experiencing that?
You're not unique. We want to think we are. But it's okay. And there are people here that can help you that have paved the way before you. So please just reach out and know that those feelings that I had of I can't navigate with, I wanted to run. I wanted to run away from every feeling I had, and now I feel comfortable sitting in them. I have a great therapist. If you need a therapist, there are also several different mental health programs, like we talked about EMDR, which is something that I did, ART, those types of interventions that can kind of help, circumvent, you getting on a right path. But I'm a big book. I love the big book. I think there's so much value in it. I think there's a lot of value in the 12 steps and the 12 traditions. So if you're willing to come into a room, even if you don't share, if you listen, because somebody might say something that just clicks for you, and if you're able, surrender, just let go. And, I turn my will over to God, sometimes multiple times an hour if I have to. And I have different books that I read, daily reflections, that really have helped me along the way. And I brought one. This is The Tears That Taught Me. And I just love this book because it just normalizes, and makes us realize that the things that we're feeling, even if there's people out there that are normies, they still experience this stuff. Being an adult is hard, and so it can get better,
Yeah.
you know? And I did want to say one of the things that I have learned since I've, during this period is the men and women that I supervised, I was pretty judgmental. And I always thought it was a moral thing.
Yeah.
Like, why can't you just get sober? All along, I couldn't get sober myself. Just understanding it's a disease, just like a cancer, and it's not something that can be fixed overnight, and it's not a choice that we make every day to just truly mess up our lives.
Right.
It's hard, but if you're willing to stick around and do the work, it's just such a great way to live your life. Just like I'm sure,
Oh yeah.
you guys know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
So-
it's not easy, but
Mm-mm.
it's like the greatest thing, once you get to that point where good things start happening and you can appreciate it,
And I try to not control things anymore. I wanted to control everything. I mean, I went around scaring the shit out of all the people that I supervised and staff members because I had such high expectations of not only me, but them. You're going to have the same high level of standard that I have in our work setting. And,
Yeah.
I've talked to those people and said I'm sorry too. But, yeah. But it's been, I wouldn't take any of it back.
Yeah.
I can tell you when I first got sober, my sponsor was Susan. She said, you flit over here and you flutter over here and you're doing this and you're doing that because I was afraid to sit.
Oh.
And I have a great therapist that will say, oh, so you're feeling something in the morning? Why don't you just acknowledge it, grab a cup of coffee and say, okay,
Yeah.
I'm anxious. Let's come sit down and let's just figure it
Right.
out instead of, because it's not going to kill me having an emotion,
Yeah.
or a feeling.
Yeah.
It won't, but just try to work through it. And so, but I'm just, I have these 3 beautiful grandchildren that I get to see all the time, and I would not have been able to do that if not for the tools of this program and the people that I have met along the path and that are there for me. People
Yeah.
like you. I get inspired every time I go to a meeting,
Yeah.
even if I don't say anything.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I appreciate you sharing, and I kind of want to give this last opportunity, if there's anything else you want to share or talk about.
one of the things that I'm most proud of my sobriety is that I no longer explain my feelings to people or negotiate or have a debate about them.
Sure.
If there's a situation that I'm feeling, or if I feel somebody's been hurtful, I just tell them. They can take it and do whatever they want
Right.
with it. I've actually had to end a friendship because somebody was like, well, you shouldn't feel that way. Well, I grew up with those words. And again,
Yeah.
my parents didn't mean harm, but that was the stuff that they learned from their family. How to tell people how to feel. So I really try to be very careful about, I always ask permission to give advice.
Sure.
But I no longer apologize for feeling a certain way if something has happened. I try to lead with love and kindness, but I'm going to tell you and take it, do whatever you want.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with that. Where before I always felt the need to defend, and when I don't defend my feelings anymore, these are what they are. And so I'm really grateful for that piece of it.
Yeah, what an incredible change. I mean, to be able to be in that place today.
Yeah, just to wake up and and I even last week something happened with a close family member that kind of shook me to the core.
Yeah.
And at first I was just like I wasn't sleeping, and then I'm like, all right, God, what do you got for me? Just
Yeah.
show me. Just tell me how to do this. Tell me what words to say. And he did. And it's not perfect right now, but it's definitely, it opens the door instead of bulldozing. Now I just try to gently decide with his help what to do and how to handle situations. That used to baffle me, right? So anyhow.
Well, I appreciate it. And you have such a unique perspective, just like with your experience in corrections and, so I'm excited to post this.
Okay.